In the middle of the national cemetery, as the battle drum still echoed and the flag remained at half-mast, a white police officer shouted straight into the female general's face, "Someone like you doesn't deserve to stand next to a flag-draped coffin." That roar struck like a slap to everyone's ears, and then he drew his gun, pointed it at her chest, and growled, "Even a general has to bow down to me." The solemn atmosphere shattered into suffocating tension. A veteran clenched his fist and yelled, "You just shot at the honor of America." From that moment on, the sacred funeral turned into an unstoppable storm of justice. The battle drum rang, long, deep, and heavy, echoing throughout the national cemetery like each beat struck directly into the hearts of those present. The sky that morning was covered in a pale gray. Clouds gathered thick across the horizon, swallowing the sunlight and casting a somber backdrop that made the morning air even more suffocating. On the wide grounds, hundreds stood silently in rows, every face carved with sorrow and reverence. The flag-draped coffin rested solemnly at the center, the American flag fluttering in the light wind, each fold seeming to cradle a lifetime of service. Wind swept through the neatly arranged white headstones. The rustling leaves blended with the funeral drum, forming a harmony both mournful and majestic. No one spoke because everyone understood this was more than a funeral. It was a reminder of sacrifice and loyalty to the nation. General Naomi Carter stood beside the coffin, her hand resting lightly on the draped cloth, fingers tracing each fold as if etch the sensation into her skin. Her eyes were deep, not bloodshot, but full of pain. A woman seasoned by war, familiar with life and death, who knew how to hold back tears to preserve a resilient image, yet this loss struck her like a hidden wave pounding the heart. She stood straight, shoulders square, every movement crisp and disciplined, like a military parade. But behind that steel exterior, her breath was heavy, her heart clenched knowing this moment was final. The line of people behind her looked at Naomi with respect because her presence beside the coffin was not just personal, it symbolized the military and the honor paid for it in blood. The crowd followed every beat of the drum, every soft note of the bugle. The family of the deceased sat in the front row, eyes reddened, holding one another tightly for strength. Veterans stood upright, chests out in old, faded uniforms, hands trembling in salute, their deeply wrinkled faces etched with years of service. Civilians were utterly silent, not daring even to cough, afraid to break the sacred stillness. Even a lost bird flying overhead seemed swallowed by the heavy air. Everything froze in place until that peace was split in two by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from behind. Bradley Cole appeared with a swagger in his stride, shoulders hunched, eyes cold as they swept across the crowd. His boots pounded loudly on the stone ground, making several people startle and turn around. While everyone else bowed their heads in remembrance, he held his head high, gaze filled with contempt, his face radiating defiance. The crowd frowned, but before anyone could speak, he snarled, his voice slicing through the solemn air. "What gives someone like you the right to stand before this casket?" The words fell heavy like a blade driven straight into everyone's chest. The drum had just fallen silent, only to be replaced instantly by that raw insult. Many stood frozen, some looking at each other in disbelief, unable to trust their ears. A few elderly veterans clenched their fists, veins bulging over wrinkled skin. The grieving family went still, some women choking back sobs. A young man in uniform shuddered slightly, his eyes shifting from reverence to rage. The solemn atmosphere now thickened unbearably heavy, as if the entire sky had collapsed. Even the softest sounds, wind leaves, seemed to vanish, leaving only a crushing silence that enveloped everything. Naomi slowly lifted her head, her gaze sharp as a blade. She didn't answer immediately, only looked straight at Bradley, eyes calm, but weighted with meaning. She knew his words weren't aimed at her alone, but at everyone present, at the flag flying above, at the history Fury carved into the sea of white headstone. Her shoulders rose slightly as if ready to brace against any storm, yet her face remained steady, unshaken, unwavering. That image only fueled the rising fury in the crowd because they saw a woman being humiliated in the most sacred moment, and she chose to face it with steel resolve. A veteran behind her, whispered voice, trembling but clear, he just insulted the entire flag. That whisper sparked like flame to dry hay, spreading instantly through the rows of seats. Dozens of eyes locked onto Bradley, sharp as blades held back but seething. A young woman standing by the casket clenched her fist, lips quivering with fury. Every breath in the crowd grew short heartbeats faster, as if something was about to explode. Bradley remained where he was, a smug look in his eyes, lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. He took their silence as consent, their angry stares as weakness. That arrogance only pushed the tension higher. But in that very moment, Naomi kept her hand on the casket, eyes steady, breath even, body unmoving like a steel statue. She knew that if she reacted in anger, the funeral would be forever stained, and she would never let that happen. The air felt frozen, and a terrifying silence blanketed the entire cemetery. The flag on the coffin fluttered gently in the wind, as if bearing witness to the disrespect that had just occurred. The breeze moved through the trees, but even its sound turned dry, no longer soft as before. Everyone sensed that even nature was holding its breath, as if the sky itself was outraged by the words just spoken. In that moment, time seemed to stop. No one said another word, but in their eyes, Bradley's contempt cracked the wall of silence. A funeral was meant for remembrance and farewell, but with a single venomous sentence, he had turned it into an invisible battleground. People can accept pain, they can endure loss, but they cannot forgive blatant disrespect in a sacred place. And from that moment on, everyone knew one thing: the storm had arrived and nothing could stop it. The moment the funeral was torn open by Bradley's voice still hung in the air, and before the crowd could catch their breath, he took another step forward, his shoes slamming hard against the cold stone, echoing dry and sharp eyes full of provocation. He scanned Naomi from head to toe, as if she were not a decorated general who had faced life and death, but a stranger who had wandered into the wrong place. The heavy atmosphere rippled through the grieving rows. The family of the deceased stiffened, eyes wide, unable to believe that in the middle of a solemn ceremony someone would dare to stain it with such venom. In front of hundreds of eyes, Bradley curled his lip, his words dropping slowly, bitterly, as if to drive the knife deeper into an already bleeding wound. Those medals on your chest are just decorations for that skin color. The cruel words hit like a hammer, making the space sway. A few women in the front row covered their mouths, soft gasps breaking out. A young veteran standing behind Naomi flinched, his hand over his heart, tightening unconsciously. Those medals stood for blood, for sweat, for tears, for lives lost on the battlefield, yet to Bradley they were nothing more than cheap ornaments because the person wearing them had skin he despised. Every eye turned to him, burning with outrage. Yet Bradley inhaled deeply, as if savoring the control he had had over the suffocating air around him. Naomi lifted her head, her hand still resting on the coffin, but her gaze now locked directly on Bradley. Her face remained still, not a crease shifting, and her voice came low and cold, every word cutting with precision. Honor isn't skin color, it's the blood that's been shed. The tone wasn't loud or sharp, but its calmness hit like a slap, making those nearby shudder. Many lifted their heads, eyes lighting up with a flicker of hope, as if they had found something solid to hold on to in the middle of an insult-laced storm. Bradley twitched the corner of his mouth, a flicker of hesitation flashing in his eyes for a split second, but he quickly masked it with a faint smile. The crowd held its breath, waiting for him to strike back, but the silence only added pressure, each heartbeat pounding loud in the chests of those witnessing the moment. In that silence, an old veteran standing beside a row of white headstones whispered, his voice raspy from years of smoke and war, but each word clear. He just insulted the entire flag. The quiet sentence landed like a spark in a barrel of gunpowder, turning the already tense air into something ready to explode. Faces faces in uniform flushed red all at once, veins rising on their temples, eyes wild like cornered beasts. To them, medals weren't for show. They were oaths paid for in the blood of their comrade. When Bradley reduced their worth to nothing more than skin color, he didn't just insult Naomi. He insulted everyone who had fallen, insulted the flag whipping in the wind, and insulted the rows of pristine white graves lined up behind them. Rage erupted, hands clenched tight, and some of the younger soldiers leaned forward as if just waiting for a signal to rise. Amid the wave of fury, Naomi stood firm, not a single wasted movement, her face carved from stone. That calm presence alone held the crowd in check. They waited for her to speak, to lead with the resolve of someone who had survived storms of fire and steel. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to raise a hand. Just that unwavering gaze was enough to make many shiver. In that moment, Naomi didn't just stand for herself. She became the embodiment of every fallen soldier, a reflection of pride that could not be denied. Bradley stared at her, the sneer still fixed on his lips, but his hand trembled slightly. He was used to bowed heads, used to silence when he spoke, but this time Naomi's composure made him feel like he was facing a wall of steel. He wanted to say more, to dig deeper with sharper words, but the crowd had begun to stir, eyes around him burning like they could devour him. Several young soldiers near him had already balled their fists, breathing heavy, waiting for just one reason to move. Naomi's hand remained on the coffin, her eyes unblinking, cutting straight through Bradley as if to peel away the smug mask he wore. She knew every cruel word couldn't break her, only revealed the truth behind the man pretending to uphold the law. Inside, her personal grief gave way to a quiet fury, but she held it down because she understood that one wrong move would plunge the ceremony into chaos. Holding the line that was her real strength, the kind that made even an enemy hesitate. The wind suddenly picked up the flag over the coffin, flapping wildly as if the sky itself raged against the filthy words just spoken. Whispers, breaths, clenched teeth, all blended into a tense rhythm that echoed through the space. Bradley inhaled, his eyes darting as if searching for approval in the crowd, but all he found was hatred. In that moment, he was no longer a police officer, he was a man alone standing before a sea of fury. In that atmosphere, Naomi stood tall, her presence like a solid landmark. The venomous remarks had exposed the truth about Bradley, but at the same time they highlighted her strength even more clearly. On one side stood filth, arrogance, and ignorance. On the other, resolve, calm, and pride. Placed side by side, the contrast was stark, fueling the crowd's anger and deepening their trust in the woman standing before the flag-draped casket. And within that contrast, a fragile line had just been drawn, signaling that this conflict would not end with words. It was on the verge of erupting into something far more forceful. The atmosphere of the funeral, already suffocating after Bradley's vile insults, now felt ready to explode. Naomi's gaze remained steady while the crowd around her churned like a sea of fire held in check. Wind swept through the row of flags at half-mast, creating a haunting, flapping sound, and the flag draped over the coffin trembled slightly with each gust, as if reacting to the disrespect that had just unfolded before it. Bradley stared at Naomi, his mocking smile twisting into something between madness and smugness. Then, in a moment no one saw coming, he reached to his waist and drew a black pistol, the motion so swift that the click of metal pierced the air like ice. The barrel pointed straight at Naomi's chest, gleaming under the pale sky like a blade poised at her heart. The entire crowd froze. Then a single scream shattered the silence. "Is he insane?" The cry echoed, rippling through the rows of mourners, causing women to scream in panic and a few children to burst into terrified sobs in their parents' arms. Veterans nearby tensed immediately, eyes bloodshot, fists tightening on their thighs. Some looked ready to lunge forward, but were caught off guard by the shock. Chaos swelled in sound faces, twisted in disbelief, all eyes locked on the weapon aimed at the woman they deeply respected. Bradley roared his voice, bouncing off the stone walls, tearing apart the sanctity of the ceremony. "Here I am, the law. Even a general bows to me." He spat each word with venom, his voice heavy with hatred, seeming to revel in the horror of the crowd. Veins bulged at his temples, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly but still holding the gun high, finger resting on the trigger ready to fire. The wind blew harder, the snapping of the flags mixing with the panicked breathing of hundreds, forming a taut sound that felt like a string about to snap. Naomi did not move her body upright like a steel pillar, her eyes locked onto the barrel. In that gaze, there was no fear, only quiet defiance. The dim light from the sky reflected off her face, sharpening its resolute features. Her heart pounded, but her breath remained steady as if she had stepped back onto the battlefield where one mistake could cost a life. Bradley's words still echoed in her mind, but they didn't shake her. They only ignited her pride even more fiercely. The crowd around her seemed frozen in place, breath held, eyes wide and unblinking. A few young soldiers behind her inched forward, their bodies tense like drawn bows ready to spring, but that trembling barrel felt like a knife driven between them, halting any reckless move. Women in the mourning rows clutched their children tightly, some covering their mouths to hold back sobs, terrified to disturb the deadly silence closing in around them. Bradley still stood there, arm extended, eyes lit with a feverish gleam. He felt power flooding his body, felt as though he was controlling the entire atmosphere, commanding the attention of hundreds. In his mind, the gun was not just a weapon, but a symbol of the domination he craved. Sweat gathered on his forehead, but he didn't wipe it away. His twisted smile revealed a sick exhilaration at seeing Naomi remain unmoved. He growled each word, carving them into the air. "Bow your head, or wait for this bullet." The wind howled louder, the flag draped over the coffin flapped violently, as if even the spirit of the fallen could not bear this disgrace. A few veterans murmured old oaths under their breath, hands trembling but eyes steady. They had seen death stood through storms of bullets, but never imagined that one day in the middle of a national cemetery during a soldier's funeral, a gun would be aimed at a general. Rage swelled, but it was held back, all of it suspended in the moment Naomi faced the dark muzzle. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, her gaze sharp and bright. She did not bow her head. Her lips tightened, then parted slightly as if ready to respond, but she held back. She knew that any word now could be the spark that set the entire moment ablaze. She let silence become her weapon, her eyes her shield. Her silence was not fear, but a declaration that honor would never kneel to a gun. Bradley locked eyes with her, his hand trembling, more sweat trailing down his cheek, yet his stare burned brighter like a man possessed. He felt himself standing at the edge between control and chaos. The thrill twisted with fury inside him, his breathing turned ragged, but he kept the gun pointed at Naomi's chest. The cemetery sank into a suffocating stillness like a valley where echoes are swallowed whole. Everyone waited for a move, a sign, anything to shatter the terrifying deadlock. Fear mixed with fury pressing down until the air felt stripped of oxygen. And in that moment, everyone knew the sacred funeral had become a battlefield where a single pull of the trigger could bury many more lives. The barrel trembled, but Bradley's eyes still burned with wildfire. He felt Naomi's silence as a challenge, a blade, digging deep into an ego already swollen with pride. He clenched his teeth, the metallic whine of the gun humming softly in the wind, creating a sound that clung to the air like a curse. The crowd glanced at one another, then back at Naomi, waiting to see what she would do. But she stood firm, a monument in the storm, proving that calm can be the most powerful weapon. That moment stretched on endlessly. People forgot the drums, forgot the morning bugle, forgot the rustling trees. There was only one image left, a gun pointed at the chest of a female general and eyes that did not waver. And it was that image that shattered the sanctity of the funeral in the hearts of those watching, because they knew that from this second on nothing would ever return to the peace they once knew. The black barrel remained fixed on Naomi's chest, the dim light from the sky reflecting off the metal, making it gleam like a freshly sharpened blade. The atmosphere of the funeral, already heavy minutes ago, had now become suffocating every breath from the hundreds gathered, pressing into a massive, unspoken silence. The battle drums had stopped, the bugle had faded, leaving only the cold rustling of wind through the flags at half-mast, a sound that resembled the choking sobs of the soul beneath the green grass. Naomi stood tall, one hand resting on the flag-draped coffin shoulders, square her body like solid steel that could not be bent. She raised her chin, her eyes fierce and locked onto the trembling man holding the gun. Her voice cut through the stifling air low and firm. "You've just insulted this nation in front of thousands of witnesses." As her words landed, the crowd jolted as if struck by lightning across a dry field. Many mourners covered their mouths, their eyes wide in shock, but also lit with a sudden spark of hope. Naomi's voice wasn't loud, wasn't harsh, but the calm weight behind each word struck deeper than any shout could. It echoed through the fear, through the tension, transforming into an accusation that made Bradley falter for a moment. He gripped the gun tighter, jaw twitching, eyes flickering. But then he smirked and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. The laugh wasn't loud, but it reverberated enough to send chills through the crowd. Bradley spat out each word, his voice hissing through clenched teeth, bitter and venomous. "You're used to giving orders, but today I'm the one in command." That sentence hit like a kick to the pride of every service member present. It laid bare his shamelessness, his disregard for the law, the flag, and the blood of those who had fallen. The crowd collectively flinched. No one dared to breathe too hard, knowing that every word he had just spoken had permanently stained this sacred ceremony. Several young soldiers standing behind Naomi bit down on their lips, eyes red with anger. An old veteran closed his eyes, both hands trembling as he murmured what sounded like an old oath. Tears of rage streamed down his deeply lined face, falling onto the faded uniform he still wore to honor the fallen. A woman in the mourning section broke into sobs, her cry tearing through the tension and sending a shudder through those around her. Everyone wanted to move to stop this disgrace, but the black barrel held them in place, locking them in a painful hesitation. Bradley stood there, his hand trembling slightly, but his eyes burned with obsession. In his mind, the gun was not just a weapon, it was absolute power. He was intoxicated by the feeling of hundreds of eyes locked on him, not looking away for a second, intoxicated by the panic that surrounded him. A twisted smile spread across his lips, sweat beading on his skin, but he didn't bother to wipe it away because he believed that in this moment he was the center, the one holding the law in his hand. Naomi looked straight into his eyes, never once flinching. Her gaze was sharp as steel, proud and unyielding. In those eyes was an entire sky of determination, a long history of fallen soldiers and the weight of national honor now staring down the barrel of a gun. She didn't lower her gaze, didn't blink as if willing her steadiness to break through the madness blazing in his. She understood clearly that if she bowed her head, everything would fall. But if she stood tall, the crowd would rise with her out of their fear. Silence blanketed the space, but it was not weakness. It was pressure building, waiting for the moment to erupt. Young soldiers held back tears but did not step back. Old veterans trembled but did not turn away. Every eye was locked on Bradley, and even though no one moved forward, their stares were weapons. In everyone's mind, Naomi was no longer just a general. She was the steel wall standing between a gun nation and a nation's dignity. Bradley inhaled sharply, then shouted again, his voice rising as if to drown out the shaking in his own limbs. "All of you, bow your heads." But no one moved. The crowd stood frozen like stone, their eyes growing more intense. They did not obey, because in Naomi's gaze they found belief. That very silence became an invisible wall, a wall Bradley could not break. He began to feel the pressure. Sweat rolled down his cheek, trailing along his jaw, but he forced himself to keep the gun raised. Naomi's eyes pierced through him like a blade tightening his chest. He felt his arrogance being challenged, felt himself exposed before hundreds of witnesses. But he did not back down. He clenched his teeth, jaw, locked eyes burning even wilder. In his mind, one thought pounded louder than the rest. If Naomi still refused to bow, he would have to pull the trigger just to prove he meant what he said. The wind roared, the flag on the coffin whipped violently, as if the soul of the fallen was rising in fury. The flapping of cloth, the rustling of trees all came together in a fierce rhythm, echoing the chaos inside every heart present. The crowd held its breath. A few tears fell silently down their cheeks, no longer tears of grief, but of fury. They knew this scene had long surpassed a funeral. It had become a scar in history. Naomi remained still, her eyes unwavering. She said nothing more, but that silence was the strongest answer of all. It defied the barrel of the gun, defied false authority, defied the rage and arrogance screaming in her face. In that moment, she showed that true leadership doesn't come from weapons, but from courage and pride. And that gaze, straight as steel, unblinking, became the flame that kept the entire crowd from collapsing under fear. That moment stretched as if it would never end. People forgot the morning bugle, forgot the drums, forgot even the rhythm of their own hearts. Only one image remained, etched into memory: a trembling police officer holding a gun, and a military general standing tall in defiance, her stare like a blade cutting through the fog of fear. And everyone understood, starting from that second, no one was allowed to bow their head again. The air in the cemetery remained heavy after the moment Naomi stood motionless before the gun. Flags snapped in the wind, and the rustling trees whispered like the voices of thousands of souls bearing witness. No one remembered the drums that had just ceased. All were trapped in a suffocating silence as a police officer dared to aim a gun at a military general in front of a flag-draped coffin. Every breath was held, every eye fixed forward. No one knew what would happen next, only that rage had built up like a river held back by a dam. And then, just when the silence felt eternal, that wall shattered. From behind the front row, two young officers sprang to their feet. Their steps struck with steady force, eyes lit with resolve. They had no patience left to watch one more second of this disgrace. Their boots thundered against the stone floor, slicing through the dense air. In a flash, they moved in behind Bradley, strong hands locking onto his arm and twisting it backward. The move was so swift that even as the crowd gasped, the gun had already been flung from his hand, clattering across the cold stone. The sharp, metallic clang echoed like a bell, breaking through every barrier, jolting the entire cemetery. The sound of the gun hitting the ground rang out across the graves, bouncing back as if to declare that madness just been brought down. Bradley let out a crazed roar, his face flushed, eyes bulging. He screamed, voice hoarse but still laced with arrogance. "Touch me, and you're defying the law." His breath came in gasps, spit flying with every word, the sound carrying across the space. But now his words no longer struck fear. They sounded like the howls of a man who had lost all control. He thrashed, but the two officers held him firm, their muscles locked like iron, pinning him in place. Murmurs erupted. A few women cried out, not from fear this time, but from the release of long-held tension. At that moment, an old veteran rose from the mourning rows. He stood tall, his back bent, but his eyes blazing, the lines on his weathered face ignited by fury. he shouted, his voice rough but thundering like a storm. "No, you're the traitor." His words pierced straight into the chest of the man who had claimed the law as his own. It wasn't just a personal outcry, it was the indictment of an entire generation, one that had stood through bombs, sworn to uphold the flag, and now saw it defiled by someone wearing a badge. The crowd surged, rows of people rising, and the murmur turned into a roar of fury that rolled across the cemetery like a wave. Naomi kept her hand on the coffin, her gaze calm as she watched, but deep in her eyes a spark lit up. She understood that her comrades would no longer accept silence. The eruption of those in uniform, of veterans who had bled, of grieving families carrying sorrow, all merged into one forceful wave. They were no longer isolated individuals, they had become a unified front, and that very unity shattered Bradley's twisted arrogance. The wind suddenly surged, whipping the half-mast flags into a frenzy, the sound of fabric cracking like lashes striking the back of a traitor. People began moving forward, their voices rising in unison, chants at first scattered but quickly gaining rhythm and power. "Justice, justice!" The cry echoed like war drums shaking the entire funeral ground. The wind, the flags, the voices fused into a storm of sound, drowning out Bradley's deranged howls. Bradley still thrashed, his face pale, then flushed eyes bloodshot, but the arrogance in his stare had collapsed. He no longer saw a fearful crowd, but a sea of fury, their eyes sharp as blades, their rage as fierce as a storm. The two officers pinned him down against the stone. His knees hit in the ground, his hands locked behind his back. He tried to scream again, but his voice cracked, swallowed by the rising chant of the crowd. Naomi slowly lifted her hand from the coffin and looked around, her eyes glowing in the dim light. She said nothing because she knew her comrades had spoken for her. The outrage of the collective had extinguished fear, and their rising showed that justice never stands still. The funeral was no longer just a farewell, it had become a symbol, a vow carved into stone that no one, whether in uniform or under the name of law, had the right to insult the honor of the nation. The chant for justice echoed again and again, sweeping through the cemetery, blending with the wind and shaking the space to its core. Those standing far away surged forward, tears falling, but their eyes shining. Some veterans wiped their faces and raised their hands in salute, reaffirming their loyalty to the ideals they once swore to and today were defending once more in this sacred place. Bradley crumpled, his face pressed to the cold stone lips, trembling but unable to speak over the roar of the crowd. He suddenly felt small, weak, swallowed whole by the storm of justice. He realized that the false power had vanished, and his cries of law now echoed like a farce. And from that moment on, he was no longer the one standing above all, but the one burned into history by hundreds of contempt-filled eyes. The wind swept through, scattering funeral petals onto the stone floor, swirling around Naomi's feet. She stood tall, gaze proud, as she watched the scene unfold like a monument carved into the moment. She knew her silence had spoken enough, her voice had been carried by her comrades, by the people. The funeral had changed in meaning. It was no longer only a farewell, but the place where justice was named, where truth was no longer silenced by the barrel of a gun. In that moment, the entire cemetery shook, not from the sound of gunfire, but from the cry of unity. Justice had been declared instantly, without need for a courtroom, without argument, but through the uprising of hundreds bound by the same belief. And from that second on, no one doubted that today would be remembered in history as the day a funeral became a battle for honor, and the comrades won by rising as one. In the moment, the gun hit the stone, and the crowd erupted in chants of justice. A quiet corner of the cemetery witnessed it all from a different angle. Near the line of trees in the back, a young woman stood among the crowd, her hands trembling as she held up her phone. She had come to the funeral to say goodbye to a loved one, never imagining she would end up recording something so horrifying. But the instant Bradley drew his weapon and aimed it at General Naomi Carter, instinct took took over. She hit record, her fingers gripping so tight her knuckles turned white. The screen shook with the pounding of her heartbeat, but the lens captured everything: the officer screaming, the trembling barrel, and the steel gaze of a general who never backed down. In the video, the chaos echoed clearly. A shout, "Is he insane?" followed by a child's scream, Bradley's crazed yelling, and then the harsh clatter of the gun hitting the stone, all fused into a distorted funeral march. The shaky camera never looked away as Naomi raised her head and spoke, her voice ringing out. "You've just insulted this nation in front of thousands of witnesses." Then came the officers rushing forward, taking Bradley down in seconds, applause and curses exploding in the background. The young woman bit her lip, tears running down her cheeks, but her hand never stopped. Deep inside, she knew the world needed to see this truth. After the ceremony ended and the crowd remained shaken, the young woman sat off to the side, heart still racing. She opened her phone, scrolled to the video, her eyes locked on the frame of the gun pointed at Naomi. Her throat tightened, but her finger hit the upload button on TikTok. Her eyes hovered over the caption. In a single breath, she typed out the words, trembling but certain. "At a funeral, a gun aimed at a general." That short line rang out like an alarm bell, exposing a raw truth that could not be explained away. The clip went live, and within minutes, views began climbing at a staggering pace. At first, a few hundred people saw it, then a few thousand, then tens of thousands. Notifications popped, nonstop comments poured in without pause. Within just a few hours, the count had crossed 1 million views, spreading like wildfire through a dry forest. Viewers couldn't believe what they were seeing, but the footage was too clear, too brutal to deny. On TikTok, the video spread like wildfire. Many users clipped the moment the gun hit the ground with a sharp clang, repeating it as proof of arrogance collapsing. Others pinned Naomi's quote, adding captions like, "Honor isn't skin color, it's the blood that's been shed." The clip became fuel igniting every platform, jumping to Twitter, Facebook, and even international forums. Comments poured in. Someone wrote, "I've never seen such disgrace from a law enforcement officer." Another shouted he aimed a gun at a general under the national flag. "That's treason, not law enforcement." Veterans from across the country shared the clip, voices shaking with anger. "We went to war, and now we watch our comrade humiliated by someone who was supposed to protect us." International voices joined in comments in multiple languages, sharing the same reaction: shock, outrage, and a demand for justice. In that flood, the clip stopped being just a video. It became living evidence, a wound exposing a truth too raw to hide. It didn't just document a funeral. It tapped into a rage long simmering beneath society. People already angry about abuse of power and invisible prejudice now had an undeniable image to rally behind. Lines reading "Justice for Naomi" began appearing everywhere, turning into a chant, drawing more voices into the conversation. In far-off streets and coffee shops, in student dorms, the clip played again and again. People pointed at screens, argued loudly, and some slammed fists on tables. Their faces held more than surprise, they showed the sting of collective shame. A police officer pointing a gun at a national general during a funeral had crossed a line, and each time the video replayed the chant of justice at the end, stirred hundreds of thousands more hearts into fury. Viewers didn't just watch, they turned the clip into a call to action. Major accounts created hashtags, and the phrase "gun at funeral" shot to the top of trending charts, drawing millions. Comments were brief but seething, unforgivable. This wasn't a mistake, it was a crime. Justice must be served. Young people pinned the clip to their profiles with bold captions, turning the incident into a social movement spreading like a storm. Meanwhile, those who had been at the cemetery began confirming the story in the comments. "I was in the third row, and I saw him draw the gun. I heard him say, "Here I am the law." No one can deny that. Their eyewitness accounts amplified the video, anchoring it deeper in truth. With every passing hour, the uproar grew. What were once isolated voices had merged into a collective roar, rising like a flood. Naomi had no idea that the young woman's clip had spread far beyond the cemetery, but her unshaken stance, unflinching gaze, and cold, steady voice had already been etched into the memory of millions. She became a symbol overnight without ever stepping onto a podium or calling herself a victim. Social media turned that truth into a fire, and every share, every comment became fresh fuel fanning the storm of justice. In just a few short hours, the entire nation reeled from a video less than a minute long. People no longer watched passively. They took to the streets, raised flags, wrote slogans, and shared the story. The clip had slipped beyond the grasp of those who wanted to bury it. It became a witness to the truth, carved into the public consciousness as proof that at a sacred funeral justice had once been threatened at gunpoint, and that truth must now be defended at all costs. The clip, showing Bradley aiming a gun at General Naomi Carter, didn't stop at TikTok. Within hours, it was shared on Facebook, spread across Twitter, flooded Instagram, and appeared on international forums. The shaky footage, the chaotic screams, and Naomi's steel gaze became living proof that shook an entire society. Overnight, 2 hashtags hatched gun at funeral and #justice for Tessa. Naomi shot to the top of trending charts, drawing in millions. Every passing second brought thousands more comments, shares, remixes of the clip with subtitles added, every word and image emphasized. The internet became a battlefield, and all eyes locked onto one event, a funeral turned nightmare. Viewers shouted through typed words and reaction videos. "This is a national disgrace," one account wrote, the outrage pulsing through all caps. That comment alone was shared over 10,000 times in just 1 hour. More videos surfaced, people filming themselves, crying, pointing at the screen, yelling, "She's a military general. Why is she staring down a gun at a funeral?" Others posted the clip of Bradley screaming, "Here I am, the law," with blood-red subtitles reading, "He's the one disgracing the law." Under each video were tens of thousands of comments, all overflowing with unstoppable fury. It wasn't just ordinary citizens speaking out. Veterans began raising their voices. One silver-haired man dressed in a worn military uniform filmed a short video and posted it to Twitter. His voice trembled but rang clear. "We faced enemies on the battlefield to defend this flag. And today in our national cemetery, a police officer pointed a gun at us. That's not law enforcement, that's betrayal." His video spread faster than anyone expected. Millions watched, hundreds of thousands shared it, and many were brought to tears as his voice broke at the end. Young people filled the comments with messages. "You're not alone. We stand with you." Eyewitness accounts flooded in. "I was sitting in the family section. I saw every second as he drew the gun. I heard Naomi say, 'You've just insulted this nation,' in front of thousands of witnesses." That sentence made my whole body shake. These first-hand voices joined the storm of public opinion, each one adding a new wave to the rising sea. Across every platform, Naomi's image standing firm before the barrel became a symbol. People began illustrating the scene, recreating it in bold strokes, often with the American flag flying fiercely in the background. Public outrage was no longer confined to the United States. Numerous international news outlets published articles, replayed the clip, and quoted the storm of fury. How can a nation that calls itself a symbol of freedom allow a police officer to point a gun at a general during a funeral, a European television network asked. Foreign journalists rushed to interview witnesses, quoting heated reactions from across social media. The storm had crossed borders, turning Naomi into a focal point not just nationally, but in the eyes of the world. On Facebook, veteran community groups coordinated to post the clip alongside calls to action. "We cannot let this insult be buried in in silence. These posts received tens of thousands of likes and comments within minutes. Young people changed their profile pictures to the image of Naomi standing before the gun, adding the words, "Justice for Naomi." On TikTok, a new trend began. Users recorded themselves placing a hand over their heart and repeating Naomi's line, "Honor isn't skin color, it's the blood that's been shed." The trend spread like wildfire, with millions of new clips appearing every hour, turning her words into a rallying cry. On Twitter, where information moves fastest, the hashtag #GunAtFuneral became a massive forum. People debated, expressed outrage, and shared personal stories of confronting abuse of power. One young veteran wrote, "I served on the battlefield with a black comrade. He fell beside me, and I buried him under this flag. Today, watching a cop mock that sacrifice makes my blood boil." The short post was shared hundreds of thousands of times, becoming a unified voice across generations. From there, the storm of anger could no longer be contained. Small protests began forming in cities across the country, with people carrying images of Naomi and signs reading "Justice for Naomi" and "End Police Abuse." They gathered outside police stations, shouting slogans and live streaming for millions to see. Online panels were hosted featuring lawyers, journalists, and human rights activists, all echoing the same conclusion. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was evidence of a long-standing sickness in the system. Naomi, at that moment, remained silent, giving no interviews. But her silence only fueled the storm. Her presence in the video was more than enough. That defiant gaze had said everything. She didn't need to defend herself or explain. The community had written her story on its own, had turned her into a living symbol of resilience and a reminder that the honor of a nation cannot be humiliated at gunpoint. As days passed, the number of views soared into the tens of millions. Major news outlets began posting the video with bold headlines. "Funeral becomes a battlefield for justice. Police officer points gun at military general in unprecedented outrage." Evening broadcasts opened with the image of Naomi standing firm, Bradley pinned to the ground, and the roar of justice rising from the crowd. Viewers at home shuddered, then quickly turned that reaction into outrage, then into an urge to share. The public storm had grown beyond anyone's control. Every comment, every share became an arrow piercing the image of law enforcement, leaving the police unable to remain silent. More importantly, turned Naomi into a banner, making millions realize that truth can be threatened at gunpoint, but it cannot be silenced. And from that moment on, no one could put out the fire raging across every platform, because it was no longer just outrage, it was the collective force of a nation demanding justice. The next morning, as the hashtags #GunAtFuneral and #Justice for Naomi still dominated the trending charts, the storm of public outrage reached the local police headquarters. The pressure grew so intense that the department was forced to hold an emergency press conference. Outside the building, dozens of reporters had gathered, early cameras and microphones raised high, their eyes filled with anticipation and barely suppressed anger. Some civilians stood nearby holding signs demanding answers, their faces tense with unrelenting fury. When the conference room doors opened, a sea of lenses immediately turned to the podium flocations, firing rapidly, the air thick like a courtroom moments before a verdict. The department's spokesperson, a middle-aged man, stepped up to the podium with a visibly strained expression. Dressed in a button shirt and tie, he tried to appear composed, but sweat glistened on his forehead. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape, and his trembling hand settled on a stack of prepared notes. As the hum of cameras and whispers fell silent, he cleared his throat and began, "The officer involved in the incident at the National Cemetery was simply carrying out his duties." The moment the sentence ended, the room erupted like a detonated bomb. Shouts rang out, cameras zoomed in, reporters shot to their feet, and fists pounded tables, shaking the entire room. A female reporter from the front row, her face flushed with fury, shouted, "What duty allows an officer to point a gun at a national general, Say it clearly, right here in front of the public." Her sharp voice echoed, triggering a barrage of questions from every direction. Who gave him that order? Why was a funeral turned into a site of violence? Is the department trying to cover this up? The storm of questions rained down relentlessly, leaving the spokesperson stammering, his face pale, his hands flipping through the papers as if hoping for a lifeline. He tried to insist, "We are conducting an internal investigation. Please trust that the police always work to ensure public safety." But every sentence was met with mocking whistles and angry boos. Another reporter stood up, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You call that safety? We just watched a clip seen by millions showing a general standing still while an officer pulled a gun and screamed, 'I am the law.' Is that what you mean by public safety?" The spokesperson froze, sweat dripping down his neck, his voice faltering, no longer steady. While the conference room burned with confrontational heat down the hall, Bradley Cole was being held in a secured area. He sat slouched against the wall, a faint smirk on his lips, eyes radiating contempt. A witness later recalled hearing him mutter as the reporters flooded in, "The crowd just needs to be silenced." That sentence reached the ears of a nearby young officer who clenched his fists, his eyes blazing. In his mind, the image of hundreds standing at the cemetery shouting "justice" still echoed, a powerful contrast to Bradley's sickening arrogance. Just minutes later, major television channels began broadcasting the press conference live. The spokesperson's stammering, the sharp questions, the pounding fists, the shouting, everything was aired without missing a beat. Viewers across the country sat in front of their screens, their outrage growing by the second. Then, some quick-thinking journalists began streaming side-by-side comparisons of the press conference with the funeral clip. As the spokesperson claimed he was just doing his job, the screen immediately cut to Bradley screaming, "I am the law." Here, the contrast was blatant, exposing every excuse as a lie. On social media, users erupted in mockery, sarcasm, and fury. "Doing his job? You mean betraying the flag? The world saw it, and yet this man dares to call it duty. This isn't a press conference, it's a public farce." The split-screen clips quickly became a new trend, bluntly titled, "Truth versus Lies." Footage of the spokesperson stuttering next to Bradley pointing a gun was edited, looped, and spread at lightning speed. The police department's credibility collapsed, turning into a national joke within a single day. Inside the press room, questions grew more relentless. Light from hundreds of camera flashes was blinding. The spokesperson's face turned pale, his throat dry. He considered ending the conference early, but the reporters wouldn't allow it. They blocked his path, firing more questions like hammers. What will the department do to take responsibility? Will Bradley Cole be prosecuted or just suspended? Will Naomi Carter receive protection? He mumbled a few evasive answers, then stepped away from the podium amid chaos, leaving behind the image of a department paralyzed by public outrage. Outside the building, crowds of citizens watched the live stream on their phones. Some turned up the speakers so everyone could hear. When the spokesperson mumbled he was just doing his job, loud whistles rang out and many raised signs shouting, "Justice for Naomi." The failure of the press conference wasn't confined to the room, it exploded into the streets. Those scenes immediately appeared on the evening news, turning the event into undeniable proof that lies had been dragged into the light. Naomi was not present at the press conference. She chose to remain silent in her modest room. But her image from the clip ran nonstop on television, now juxtaposed with biting commentary about the police spokesperson. Her silence no longer represented darkness, but rather a light in contrast to the chaos of others. The more people compared, the clearer it became. One side stood with courage and clarity, the other with stammering and evasion. And from that contrast, public trust shifted entirely toward Naomi pushing the police department deeper into a credibility crisis they could no longer escape. Within less than a day, the failed press conference had become a hot topic. On talk shows, journalists, lawyers, and scholars dissected every word and phrase. Everyone agreed this was not merely a media failure, but clear evidence of a decaying system accustomed to cover-ups. With the public already holding the video clip, every excuse only made the truth sharper. The outrage had been doused with fuel, and that fire would continue to blaze in the days ahead. After the failed press conference, public outcry no longer stopped at angry comments or spontaneous protests. The storm had moved beyond local boundaries, reaching the very center of national power. In Congress, several lawmakers could no longer remain silent as the video clip continued to dominate television and online platforms. A senator known for his hardline stance on security issues shared the clip on his personal page with a blunt caption that struck like a hammer. "Insult in the military crosses the red line." That post immediately drew millions of reactions, marking the first official statement from the ruling class. It not only validated the public's outrage, but also signaled that the matter would be reviewed at the highest level. Other lawmakers quickly followed, holding press conferences, appearing on television, and joining public forums to state their positions. Urgent questions poured in. How could a police officer brazenly point a gun at a general in a national cemetery in front of hundreds of witnesses and beneath a lowered flag? Their tone was no longer vague or diplomatic, but stern and warning, as if any delay in addressing the incident would be seen as a betrayal of public trust. Alongside the political response, the Department of Defense issued an official statement calling for a special investigation. The document, signed by top military commanders, declared that this was not merely a personal misconduct, but an affront to the honor of the entire armed forces. Military investigators were assigned to work with federal agents to review every detail. What had once been labeled a singular incident was now elevated to a matter of national security. All local reports were to be sent directly to the Pentagon, bypassing intermediate levels of authority. News of the special investigation immediately became a national focal point. Major news outlets ran nonstop coverage, and images of government vehicles entering and leaving the local police station further convinced the public that justice was approaching. Security experts and retired generals were invited to analyze the situation bluntly, stating this was an opportunity to uncover not just Bradley Cole's accountability, but also systemic failures. The pressure came down like a flood, pushing local authorities into a completely reactive position. Naomi Carter remained silent, but her silence now carried tremendous weight. She didn't need to speak. Congress, the Department of Defense, and millions of citizens were speaking for her. What had seemed like a personal tragedy at a funeral had been elevated to the national agenda, becoming a test for the entire political and legal system. And in the heart of this storm, all eyes turned to the nation's leaders, waiting to see if they had the courage to prove that justice could not be buried by any force. Since Congress and the Pentagon spoke out, public outrage erupted into concrete action. Veteran organizations that had existed for years now for the first time set aside all differences to unite. They wore their old uniforms, medals pinned to their chests, and marched through the streets with banners boldly declaring justice for Naomi. The pounding of drums merged with synchronized footsteps, forming a march that echoed memories of old battlefields. Bystanders stopped many in tears at the sight of silver-haired veterans standing tall, hand in hand, raising the national flag as a living oath. Each procession drew hundreds more, from youth and students to workers, all merging into a wave sweeping through city boulevards, becoming the largest march since the end of the war. In major squares, thousands of veterans stood in straight lines, saluting military style before large portraits of Naomi Carter. They chanted in unison, not just demanding justice for her, but defending the honor of all who had fallen under the flag. Their voices echoed between towering buildings, making the entire city tremble as if shaken by an earthquake. Reporters and news crews scrambled to capture the moment, and those solemn yet fervent scenes spread rapidly further, igniting public anger at Bradley's defiance. Veteran groups sent formal petitions to the Department of Defense demanding strict punishment and a complete overhaul of police oversight systems. While the marches continued with no signs of stopping, news about Bradley Cole spread quickly. At first, the local police department attempted to remain silent, but public pressure and firm statements from Congress left them no escape. Around midnight, a brief statement was released. Bradley was officially suspended indefinitely, pending investigation. The announcement aired on television and triggered an explosive response. People cheered, marching groups roared, and thousands of phones captured the screen, posting it online with captions like, "Justice has begun." For many, the suspension was just a first step, but it carried deep meaning. Proved that the truth was no longer ignored, that the power of the people, of those who had bled for the nation, could force an entire system to bow. Veterans in the procession exchanged nods through tears, knowing the fight for honor was far from over. But at least on that night, justice had been named. The city did not sleep. The lights stayed on, footsteps and chants echoed through the streets, etching into memory that from a funeral dishonored a movement had risen, and the arrogant officer who once pointed a gun at a general had now bowed and left the ranks. After days of silence, Naomi Carter's appearance on live television left the entire nation holding its breath. She sat across from the host in a brightly lit studio. Her face composed, her eyes sharp yet gentle. Viewers watching from home could see her hands resting calmly on the table, not a trace of tremble in her posture, upright and steady, as if she were seated before a congressional hearing rather than an interview. When the host asked what she wished to say after everything that had happened, Naomi raised her head, and her voice rang out firm and clear, each word landing like a nail. "I don't speak for myself, but for everyone who has ever been humiliated." In that moment, the studio fell completely silent. At home, millions watched live, many unable to hold back their tears. Naomi's voice didn't waver, didn't show resentment, but carried a firmness and conviction that felt like a command. Behind her composure was a deep, unwavering strength, one forged through bitter experiences she and so many others had endured. As the camera zoomed in, her eyes reflected that resilience, and viewers could feel she was speaking for them, for those without a voice in society. A woman in Chicago later shared on air that she broke down in tears the moment Naomi spoke. "I remembered the times I was pulled over just because of my skin color. When she firmly said, 'I don't speak for myself,' I knew I wasn't alone anymore." Others echoed similar thoughts on social media, admitting they cried as Naomi's voice rang out not just words, but the return of faith long suppressed by injustice. In the studio, the host paused for a few seconds before asking the next question. That brief silence alone told the audience this was no ordinary interview, but a historic moment. Naomi didn't shout or dramatize. She spoke of fallen comrades, of witnessing her loved ones being dismissed, and of the invisible wounds carried by her community. "If we stay silent, every insult will become normal. If we speak out, the truth will find its way." Her words left a deep mark on listeners, moving many to tears they couldn't hold back. The interview ended with a round of applause from the production crew, a rare moment in live broadcast history. But its impact didn't stop there. On social media, clips from the interview spread like wildfire, especially the moment Naomi lifted her head and said, "I don't speak for myself." It quickly became a new rallying cry, seen on protest signs, profile pictures, and in thousands of heartfelt posts. People saw in her a spiritual leader, someone who could transform personal pain into collective strength. Naomi's appearance on television didn't just win her public sympathy. It reinforced the belief that justice was standing on the side of truth. She didn't promise anything grand. She simply spoke from experience and courage. That alone moved millions to tears, and from those tears, unity became even stronger. With her steady voice, Naomi Carter transcended the image of a victim. She became a flame of inspiration for a new generation, one that believes honor and justice cannot be buried. After the live interview, Naomi's words were clipped and spread across platforms. Among them, the phrase, "honor does not tremble," stood out most, repeated endlessly by online communities as if it were a new spiritual banner for society. community. Those words appeared on posters painted boldly on the walls of major cities, sprayed as graffiti across subway stations, and even turned into background music for thousands of TikTok clips recreated by young people. Just hearing those 4 words was enough to feel the latent power, a proud message that a person's honor and a community's cannot be broken by bullets or threats. Schools began holding discussion sessions with teachers playing the clip for students to analyze. Many students, for the first time, heard a general speak about honor with a calm yet powerful voice, and they started talking about how true strength doesn't come from control or force, but from standing firm against injustice. From those small classrooms, the phrase "honor does not tremble" was written on blackboards, copied into notebooks, and slowly sparked small movements among youth movements that gradually merged into a powerful current. On the streets, the slogan echoed through ongoing marches. People raised banners high, shouting each word, their chants echoing down boulevards, pushing past police barricades, and turning into a thunderous call inside the hearts of all who heard it. To veterans, it was a reminder of the comrades who had fallen that their blood was not spilled in vain. To the younger generation, it was a vow that no act of humiliation would go unchallenged. Across all layers of society, those 4 simple words brought people together, transforming outrage into unified strength. From a single incident at a funeral, the event grew into a massive social movement. Human rights groups, student associations, veteran alliances, and even small grassroots collectives joined the cause. With each passing day came new marches, forums, and media campaigns. International news outlets covered it non-stop, calling it the Uprising of Honor, comparing the movement to an unstoppable wave. People were no longer standing alone. They had turned personal outrage into collective power. And that collective force now pressed those in power to face a hard question. How will justice be served when an entire society has risen as one? In every home, every office, on social media, and out in the streets, people spoke of honor does not tremble as a guiding principle. It became a way to dispel fear, to confront the truth that a police officer had dared insult the military, but also a promise that they would not allow history to repeat itself. From the funeral of a soldier, the nation witnessed the rise of a social movement, one that affirmed the power of shared belief, a power not born of weapons, but of millions of voices united in a single message. After the social movement spread across cities, public pressure pushed the case onto the desks of the highest authorities in the justice system. The office of the federal prosecutor quickly became the center of attention where the lights of the press and the hopes of millions converged. Shelves already filled with case files now overflowed with hundreds of documents, transcripts, reports, and video clips collected from the scene. Each file was a puzzle piece, and together they formed a complete picture of an undeniable truth. Federal investigators worked around the clock, eyes bloodshot, but spirits high, knowing that even the smallest detail could become evidence in court. Clips filmed from various angles were downloaded and analyzed frame by frame. On the conference room screen, the image of Bradley pointing a gun at Naomi was enlarged, each frame slowed down for inspection. His screams were isolated, his hateful tone analyzed by language experts. Not just the viral clip on social media, but numerous other videos from attendees at the funeral were submitted as well. All of it built a massive data archive, with each piece aligning and reinforcing the others, leaving no room for excuses. Alongside the footage, witness statements were gathered. Dozens of people, from elderly veterans to young students, entered the interview room to give testimony. They spoke with fury, many tearing up as they recalled the moment the gun was aimed at Naomi. One young woman recounted in a trembling voice how she clearly heard Bradley say, "I'm the law here," a phrase that still sent chills down her spine. A veteran slammed his hand on the table as he signed his statement, emphasizing that to him, the act was not just an insult to Naomi, but an affront to the entire military and the national flag. These testimonies, combined with video and audio evidence, made the case heavier and more more concrete. Not long after, investigators officially confirmed Bradley's use of discriminatory slurs, from recordings captured by witnesses to his voice echoing in viral footage. It became clear this was not a momentary outburst, but the manifestation of deeply rooted hatred. His mockery of Naomi's skin color, his vile words belittling her medals, and ultimately pointing a gun at her in a cemetery all came together as irrefutable evidence. In a memo to higher authorities, the federal prosecutor emphasized that this case was symbolic of abuse of power and discrimination, and demands a sentence strong enough to deter. The atmosphere inside the prosecutor's office grew increasingly tense, yet clearer than ever. All roads led to the same conclusion: Bradley Cole had not only committed serious violations of the force's code of conduct, but had also broken the law in front of the public and the nation. On the desk, case files stamped in red "Urgent" were ready to move to the next phase of the legal process. Outside, the social movement still burned fiercely, but inside that office, justice was being organized page by page, word by word, waiting for its moment to step into the light of the courtroom. Once the evidence collection process was complete, the federal prosecutor issued a decision that the public had long awaited. A carefully drafted indictment spanning dozens of pages outlined in detail each of Bradley Cole's violations. The focus was on two major charges: endangering the life of a high-ranking officer and abuse of weapon authority in a designated security zone. Video clips were printed and attached as appendices. Witnesses were listed in full. Every insult, every act of aiming a gun was time-stamped. There was no room left for evasion as the evidence laid bare the truth, rendering all previous justifications meaningless. News of the indictment spread quickly through the media, sparking a wave of public reaction. Those who had taken part in the marches cheered as the announcement aired, seeing it as a crucial milestone on the road to justice. Veteran organizations released joint statements declaring that the indictment was not just a punishment for one man, but a confirmation that the honor of the military had been defended. Young people reposted the news with captions reading, "This is when real justice begins." As public sentiment surged inside the prosecutor's office, the case files were compiled, stamped, and delivered directly to the federal court. This act marked a pivotal shift, pulling the entire matter out of local hands and placing it under the authority of judges and jurors with the highest level of power. Federal investigators handed off every piece of evidence to the legal team, along with detailed reports outlining the context, motive, and consequences of Bradley's actions. Every step was conducted under strict supervision to ensure that this time justice could not be distorted. The federal court received the case in an atmosphere unlike any before. Stacks of documents covered the clerk's desks, video footage was stored in secure drives, and witness lists were sorted into thick files. Each page recorded not only the misconduct of a police officer, but also reflected the rising wave of public outrage. The judges understood this was not merely a criminal case, but a test of the people's faith in the justice system. The local police chief received notice of additional officers being suspended for their role in covering up the incident further, proving that the system no longer had room for tolerance. The news continued to spread, reinforcing public belief that every step was moving closer to the truth. The transfer of the case to the federal court became a defining milestone, signaling that the situation had gone beyond the control of any local authority, and this time all eyes would be watching every phase of the trial. In that atmosphere, justice was no longer just a sentence for one man, but a declaration that the nation's honor would never bow to guns or abuse of power. On the first day of the trial, the grounds of the federal courthouse were packed. Journalists crammed together, lenses aimed directly at the main entrance where everyone waited for the moment Bradley Cole would appear. The early air was crisp breath, visible in the cold, but the crowd's fury heated the space with intensity. Every footstep echoed, every shout thundered, blending into a wall of pressure weighing on the steps leading to the court. When the doors opened, Bradley was escorted out wearing wearing a dark suit, his face expressionless, eyes avoiding contact. He tried to appear composed, but his hand trembled slightly, fingers clenched into fists, veins bulging at his neck. The crowd erupted immediately, screams crashing like waves tearing through the air. People shouted his name, called him the vilest of names, and saw him as the embodiment of betrayal. Police sirens shrieked, but they couldn't drown out the chants from the crowd. They held up hastily written signs, the capital letters sharp and furious, "Half in prison." The slogan rang like a collective verdict repeated in a unified rhythm that shook the plaza. Each shout was a blow to the cold image Bradley tried to maintain. Many women brought photos of Naomi Carter, raising them high for the cameras to capture, as if to declare who truly deserved protection. They shouted her name, paired it with the phrase "honor does not tremble," directing it at Bradley, forcing him to face the truth that his actions had shamed the nation. An elderly veteran, his hand trembling, held up a sign reading, "Betrayed the flag," his tear-filled eyes burning with intensity, his voice hoarse but firm as it joined the crowd. Bradley kept trying to walk upright, shoulders squared, but every step grew heavier. The chant, "Life in prison," echoed from all directions like invisible chains dragging him down. Reporters, pressed against the security barricade microphones, aimed forward, questions firing like bullets. "Do you feel remorse? What do you say about the cemetery incident? Do you think you can escape justice?" He didn't answer, just twisted his lips into a crooked smile, but it was instantly drowned out by the roar of thousands. As he stepped up the courthouse stairs, camera flashes exploded. His expressionless face splashed across front pages and live feeds. That image would be remembered not as defiance, but as collapse, because in front of him was no longer silence, but the united voice of the people. When the courtroom doors shut behind him, the chant, "Life in prison," still echoed, refusing to fade like a soundtrack that couldn't be muted, following Bradley inside, reminding him that from this moment on his fate no longer belonged to him, but to justice. After Bradley was taken inside, the atmosphere outside the courthouse remained tense like a stretched wire. But the moment Naomi Carter appeared on the steps, the entire crowd fell silent. She wore her formal military uniform, walking slowly but steadily, saying nothing. Her face calm as if she carried the weight of millions on her shoulders. That silence was not avoidance, but a quiet declaration that she did not need to defend herself because the truth was already undeniable. All eyes turned to her, and in that moment reverence spread like a wave. People lowered their protest signs, but instead of shouting, they bowed their heads in unison. Some raised a hand in a military salute. Even the reporters pushing through the crowd softened their voices, and cameras moved slowly, capturing her image as if recording a moment in history. Naomi stepped through the courthouse doors, needing no speech, no wreaths, no banners, because her composure alone affirmed the dignity and strength of someone who refused to bow to injustice. As she disappeared behind the heavy wooden doors, the plaza let out a collective sigh, not of fatigue, but of release from a pain that had been building since the day of the funeral. An elderly woman in the crowd wiped her tears and whispered to someone beside her, "She carries the honor of all of us." That quiet phrase echoed through the crowd, becoming a silent agreement that no slogan could ever match. Inside, the trial opened under unprecedented attention. Dozens of news channels broadcast live. International media filled every seat in the gallery, and the world waited to watch justice at work. The judge entered, struck the gavel, the sound echoing through the courtroom, marking the beginning of a case seen as a test of faith in the legal system. The jury took their seats, Hoemam faces reflecting the tension of this historic moment. Every gesture, every word spoken in that courtroom would be dissected in detail because outside, millions of eyes were watching. The atmosphere inside the courtroom stood in stark contrast to the scene at the gate. Here, there was solemnity. Each heavy wooden bench, each yellow light casting down on the desks created a setting both dignified and cold. Behind the jury box, reporters took meticulous notes, microphones positioned on tables ready to transmit even the smallest sound. Attention was focused not only on the defendant, Bradley Cole, but also on Naomi seen as a living witness, a symbol of honor violated but unbroken. As she took her seat, no one dared whisper. No one was distracted, and the entire room seemed to orbit her presence. From this moment forward, the case was no longer just a matter of one officer's abuse of power. It became a test of the entire society's trust. The trial opened under nationwide scrutiny with no room left for ambiguity or concealment. Outside, the crowd continued to wait, chants echoing into the building, while inside those in black robes and formal military uniforms prepared to face the truth. Justice had stepped through the courthouse doors, and from here, every ruling would not only determine the fate of one man, but also affirm the honor of the nation. When the judge struck the gavel to begin the witness examination, the already tense courtroom fell into near total silence. The lights were adjusted to focus directly on the witness stand, where, one by one, individuals stepped up to recount what they had seen at the National Cemetery. Everyone in the room held their breath, knowing that each word spoken here would carve another layer into the case, turning the public outrage outside into legal force within. When the door opened, an elderly veteran entered leaning on a cane, his white hair shimmering under the lights, his face lined with age, but his eyes still sharp. He moved slowly, each tap of the cane echoing on the tiled floor, drawing the room into a stillness that followed his every step. As he reached the witness stand, his hands trembled, knotted fingers gripping the wooden edge for balance. The judge gave a slight nod, and the prosecutor invited him to speak. His voice was raspy, but rang out clearly, each word drawn from deep within. I saw the gun pointed at the casket. That single statement struck the courtroom like a thunderclap, thickening the air with its weight. Observers clenched their fists unconsciously, and some reporters immediately wrote it down, recognizing the raw gravity behind that one plain sentence steeped in a lifetime of military service. He did not embellish or dramatize. It was enough to make hearts ache. Immediately after his testimony, the prosecutor signaled the technician to play a submitted video clip. The courtroom dimmed under the glow of the large screen where every detail was cast in sharp relief. Bradley appeared, face tense, hand trembling as he held the gun, its dark barrel aimed directly at Naomi Carter, standing beside a flag-draped casket. His screams burst through the speakers, tangled with cries, panic, and finally the sharp clatter of the gun hitting the stone floor. The scene reassembled the infamous funeral moment, pulling the room back to the instant that had shaken the entire nation. The courtroom was breathlessly still. No one moved, no one spoke. The images on the screen seemed to freeze all motion, forcing each person to confront an undeniable truth. In the gallery, where reporters and citizens sat, some covered their mouths, others teared up at the sight of Naomi's steady gaze under the barrel. Even the jurors, trained to remain composed, bent slowly over their notepads, their expressions stiffening, eyes flickering with barely contained anger. The elderly veteran remained at the witness stand, his eyes brimming, but his voice steady. He repeated, more slowly this time, as if to carve the words into everyone's mind. I saw it with my own eyes right in front of the casket. He dared to point a gun. That statement, combined with the video on screen, pierced through every defense Bradley's legal team had built. Faced with living truth and a credible witness, the entire courtroom understood there was no way out. Justice was no longer a slogan. It now stood clearly in every testimony, every frame. And, in that breathless silence, the people's belief that justice would prevail began to take root, firm and undeniable. When the clip ended, the courtroom remained steeped in heavy silence, the air so tense one could hear a reporter's pen gently tapping on the table. Bradley's defense attorney rose suddenly, scrambling to regain balance for his client, but the moment he opened his mouth, his voice wavered, tongue faltering mid-sentence. He attempted to argue the footage could have been edited, only to be countered immediately by the prosecutor presenting dozens of videos from multiple angles, all all matching detail for detail. The lawyer pivoted, claiming Bradley acted out of panic, but that argument collapsed when the prosecution played the recording of Bradley shouting, "I'm the law here." The entire room turned to look at the attorney, whose face flushed sweat breaking on his brow, hands trembling as he flipped through the papers, unable to find a single defense strong enough to stand. The jury, seated front and center, watched every moment closely, their expressions beginning to shift. At first, they wore the neutral calm of trained observers, but as they listened to the veteran's unwavering account, rewatched the footage, and witnessed the defenses unraveling, their faces hardened. Some bent over to write notes, pens pressing harder against the page, while others looked up and stared directly at Bradley with cold, unflinching eyes. The change needed no words, but everyone in the room could feel it. Bradley sat in the defendant's chair trying to appear motionless, but the sweat streaking down his cheeks betrayed him. Each time his lawyer stammered, his hands clenched tighter on the arms of the chair, his eyes darted around the courtroom only to find every gaze fixed on him with unmistakable contempt. In that moment, the arrogance he once displayed at the funeral was gone, replaced by the image of a man cornered with nowhere left to run. The courtroom now felt completely detached from the outside world, where millions were watching live through their screens. Every small movement was magnified into a signal, hinting at which way the scales of justice were tipping. The more silent the jury remained, the more the seriousness in their eyes made Bradley feel that the road ahead was rapidly narrowing. Both the public and those present understood that the decisive moment was approaching, and by then no excuse would carry any weight. In that overwhelming silence, the authority of the court was not asserted through words, but through the eyes of those who would determine Bradley's fate. And it was in the jury's tightening expressions that the message became clear. Truth had prevailed, justice was taking shape, and there was no longer room for clumsy defenses. When the final testimonies were recorded and the hearing temporarily concluded, the jury left the courtroom in tense silence. They entered the closed chamber designated for deliberation, the heavy door shutting behind them, sealing off all outside noise. Inside, there was only a long table, thick stacks of files, and the solemn faces of each member. They sat down, opened the files, reviewed their notes, their eyes pensive, as if they were examining not just one man's actions, but the truth that had shaken a nation. Every detail was revisited, not a single second of footage or word spoken in the courtroom was overlooked. One juror began summarizing from the moment Bradley appeared at the funeral, from his hateful remarks to the instant he pulled a gun and aimed it at General Naomi Carter. Others nodded occasionally, interjecting with additions from their own notes. Each person worked to remain objective in their analysis, though their voices still carried a trace of anger. The evidence was too clear, the act too blatant, making every defense from the accused feel even more out of place. One juror played the audio clip again, letting the group hear Bradley shout, "I'm the law here." The sentence echoed through the small room like a hammer strike. No one spoke for a few seconds, their eyes all turning in the same direction, silent but in agreement. Another juror turned over a still image from the footage showing the gun barrel aimed directly at the flag-draped casket. The aged hand of a female juror trembled as it touched the photo. She took a deep breath and said slowly, "If we turn our backs on this evidence, what meaning does justice still hold?" The room fell quiet again, but their gazes grew more resolute. The deliberation went on, every small detail dissected thoroughly. They discussed psychological factors, the possibility of panic, and then circled back to the fact that nothing could justify pointing a gun at a general during a national funeral. The more they analyzed, the clearer it became how dangerous that act was, not just to Naomi Carter as an individual, but to the entire public's faith in law enforcement. Some nodded silently, others spoke briefly, but all arrived at the same conclusion: Bradley Cole must be held accountable under the law. When the final summary was written, no one objected. Consensus came swiftly, not from haste, but because the truth was undeniable. No one among them disputed Bradley's guilt. Not a single doubt remained. The chamber was filled with a heavy sense of duty, but also a feeling of relief, as if a veil had finally been lifted from the truth. truth. As the last signature was placed on the document, each juror knew their decision would not only determine one man's fate, but also reaffirm the meaning of justice in the eyes of the entire nation. After hours of deliberation and dissecting every detail, the silence inside the jury chamber was broken by the soft rustle of paper. On the table, the final verdict form was placed at the center, and all 12 members looked at one another before signing their names one by one onto the decision slip. No one hesitated, no one avoided it. The consensus was clear in their eyes and solemn expressions. The final conclusion was sealed unanimous agreement that Bradley Cole had committed a serious crime and must receive the heaviest sentence allowed by law. That decision echoed in each member's heart, as they knew it was not just a sentence for one man, but a message to society about the boundaries that must never be crossed. As the verdict form was placed into a sealed envelope, the room fell silent for a few seconds, as if everyone needed a deep breath. A few jurors quietly folded their hands silently, offering a prayer for justice. Then they all stood exiting the closed chamber with composed faces and eyes free of hesitation. The door opened, light from the courtroom spilling in, and the crowd instantly fixed their eyes on them. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready to record every movement. The prosecution sat upright, while the defense lawyer kept his head down, eyes full of worry. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was so heavy that no one dared to breathe too loudly. Bradley sat in the defendant's chair, pale-faced, sweat beading on his forehead. He tried to sit upright, but his back had already begun to slouch. Naomi Carter sat in the front row as silent as ever, her expression calm, her eyes unwavering. The public gallery, from journalists to permitted civilians, all turned toward the long table where the jury was returning. Every gaze was tense, because they knew this moment would decide everything. The presiding judge tapped the gavel, lightly signaling the courtroom to remain quiet. The sound echoed upward, hit in the high dome, then fell into complete silence. The entire room seemed frozen, every person sitting upright, hands, clenched hearts pounding. Each passing second stretched endlessly, and the weight of anticipation grew unbearable. Everyone understood that justice was now sealed in that envelope, waiting only for the judge to declare it. Behind them, many people were in tears without even realizing it, having lived under tension for so long. Photographers held their cameras steady, ready to capture the historic moment. In the gallery, an elderly veteran clutched his military cap tightly in his hands, eyes closed, waiting to hear the final verdict. Everyone shared the same emotion, waiting for the moment when justice would speak. And as the air in the courtroom reached the point of suffocating stillness, with every heart suspended in silence, the entire nation watching the live broadcast also held its breath, waiting for the fateful moment to be announced. The loud bang of the gavel echoed through the packed courtroom, the sound bouncing off the high dome ceiling and drawing every eye to the elevated bench where the judge sat. He looked directly at the defendant. His voice lowered, every word clear and firm. Defendant Bradley Cole, life in prison. The verdict struck the thick air like a hammer blow, leaving the room momentarily stunned. The silence lasted only a few seconds before the entire courtroom erupted like a crashing wave. Applause, thundered cries mixed with chants, all blending into a chaotic symphony of release. Those who had held back for the entire trial now let go, tears rolling down their cheeks as radiant smiles broke through. In the gallery, veterans embraced one another, their deeply lined faces lit with the belief that the honor of the military had been upheld. A young woman burst into sobs, her trembling hands raising a photo of Naomi Carter, as if sending thanks to the one who had stood firm in front of a gun at a funeral. Sobs rose from all corners, but every tear was one of relief, of satisfaction that justice was no longer a distant dream. Reporters captured every moment, camera shutters flicking constantly, freezing the sight of hundreds of hands clapping endlessly as if to carve this moment into history. Bradley sat frozen in the defendant's chair, eyes wide but empty, his skin pale. At the sound of the verdict, he flinched slightly, lips quivering, but no words came. His face showed no trace of the arrogance once on display, only confusion and despair remained. Every clap, every sob echoed around him like 1,000 knives twisting in his mind. The life sentence didn't just end his freedom, it buried the image of a man who once screamed that he was the law. Naomi sat silently in the front row, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes bright but calm. She didn't smile, nor did she cry. She simply bowed her head slightly as if to honor the fallen comrades and all the citizens who had stood beside her in the fight for justice. As she looked around, she saw radiant faces streaked with tears, saw unity shining across the courtroom. In that moment, she understood that the story hadn't merely ended with a sentence, it had begun with a new belief, the belief that justice could prevail when people rise together. The applause had not yet faded when the judge struck the gavel once more to restore order, but even he paused for a few seconds to listen to the overwhelming energy that filled the room. The sentence had been handed down, and with it a new chapter of history had just been written. The tears, the applause, and the shining eyes were all proof that justice, though delayed, could still restore faith in the human heart. When the clapping and crying finally faded, all eyes turned once more toward the defendant. Bradley sat motionless, his face pale as if all life had drained from him. Beads of sweat rolled down his temples and soaked into his collar, but he no longer had the strength to wipe them away. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly into space, lips parting slightly and then closing again, unable to form a sound. In that moment, all the arrogance he had once displayed at the funeral, every defiant word he had shouted in court, disappeared, leaving only a crumpled figure. Bradley bowed his head, shoulders trembling slightly as if even he could not believe his life of freedom had ended with the words "life in prison." His silence seemed to suspend the entire courtroom. Scattered sighs rose from the gallery, and a few people exchanged nods, quietly acknowledging that justice had finally been served. But then a single image shifted the atmosphere entirely. Naomi Carter, who had sat silent throughout the sentencing, suddenly rose. She turned to face the judge, raised her hand to her forehead, and executed a crisp, formal military salute. The motion was firm and deliberate, and the light streaming in from the high windows illuminated her face with renewed brilliance. In that instant, the whole room seemed to move as one. The row of veterans rose immediately, returning her salute, eyes brimming but glowing with pride. Young soldiers in uniform stood straight saluting in precise unison. Even the civilians in the audience, though not military themselves, stood and bowed their heads in respect. A wave of unity swept the courtroom, sparked by Naomi's simple gesture, transforming a space once tense with legal conflict into one filled with reverence and solidarity. The courtroom lights reflected off the many faces turned toward her. No one spoke. No slogans were needed. No declarations required, only a solemn silence that carried farther than any applause could. Bradley remained bowed, unable to lift his head to witness the moment, knowing he had just been judged not only by law, but by the spirit of those standing proudly before him. Naomi lowered her hand, gave a slight nod, and returned to her seat. She didn't need to speak. Her actions had said everything. The entire courtroom rose in her wake, not because of the sentence, but because in her presence they saw the very embodiment of justice and honor. In that perfect blend of silence and solemnity, the sentencing came to a close, leaving behind the lasting truth that the triumph of justice isn't only written in court records, but etched deeply into the hearts of every person who witnessed it. Right after the trial, the streets surrounding the local police department became the gathering place for a wave of angry yet proud citizens. They arrived early in the morning holding banners and wearing photos of Naomi Carter standing tall under the barrel of a gun, treating her as a living symbol of unyielding belief. Many crafted their own signs with bold words like "Justice for Naomi" and "Honor doesn't tremble," raising them high before the media's cameras cameras, eyes burning with determination. The atmosphere was thick, not with chaos, but with the power of a united community rising up to force the system to listen. Cries of "no more abuse" erupted from the front lines, echoing backward and sweeping through the crowd like an unstoppable wave. Voices were hoarse from shouting, hands clenched in the cold, all forming a relentless rhythm that seemed to shake the ground. A group of students carried loudspeakers, taking turns reading stories of past abuses by the police, turning personal pain into public testimony. After each story ended, the chant, "No more abuse," grew louder, pulling dozens more into a crowd that had already filled the entire plaza outside the police station. Veterans were present, too, old jackets draped over faded uniforms, their eyes still sharp. They stood in formation, not shouting much, but saluting in military fashion, holding a solemn silence that served as a shield for the spirit of the protest. Their presence strengthened the crowd's resolve, standing as proof that this fight wasn't against the law itself, but in defense of honor and justice. News outlets recorded nonstop, broadcasting live images of citizens flooding the streets. Millions watched across the country, many unable to attend, but hanging signs at their doors or posting Naomi's photo with slogans online. International human rights organizations also responded, sharing images of thousands gathered in unified voice, calling it clear evidence of a powerful civic awakening. Though local police had set up heavy iron barricades, they no longer dared act aggressively. After the trial, any move against public sentiment would immediately spark a new wave of outrage. They stood silently watching the growing crowd, the rising chants. The frozen expressions beneath their helmets couldn't hide their unease, because what stood before them wasn't just a few scattered individuals, it was an entire community united. The entire city shook with the sound of synchronized chants, lights from raised phones creating a dazzling sea of illumination. The grief from that day had transformed into the momentum of a massive movement. From personal pain, from a funeral torn apart by violence, the community had risen as a unified force carrying a clear message: no more abuse. And that chant didn't echo through just one plaza. It spread far across the country as a warning that the era of silence was over. The pressure from thousands gathered in front of the police station turned a once quiet location into the nation's focal point. The iron barricades meant to divide now stood as a symbol of the gap between the people and those sworn to protect them, but the unified voices forced a shift from within. Local police commanders, long used to giving orders, now stood silent behind ranks of officers, faces stiff, eyes avoiding the crowd. Under the weight of Lee broadcasts, they had no excuse left strong enough, only the choice to step forward, speak softly, and listen to the voice of the people. The moment senior officers bowed and pledged to review reforms marked the first sign of concession, a rarity in the force's history. Within that moment, change began to unfold. People realized their voices were no longer wasted. Each echoing slogan had started to move the entire system. Civil society groups quickly formed networks, drafted lists of reform demands, and issued clear recommendations for police oversight, transparency, and the use of force and stronger accountability. These proposals weren't just shouted in marches. They were delivered directly to Congress and the Department of Justice, compelling authorities to take them seriously. On online forums, a wave of active discussions erupted. Citizens moved beyond outrage to talk solutions, to explore how a fairer system could be built. Small roundtables in schools, community meetings, and local halls all centered around a story that began with a funeral derailed by arrogance. This society can't go back to the way it was, a professor said in a live-streamed talk, a quote shared millions of times, becoming a widely embraced truth. Younger generations looked to Naomi as a role model, anchoring themselves in the phrase, "honor doesn't tremble." High school students painted slogans on shirts. University students hosted open forums on justice and equality. What was once a private pain had become a collective lesson, a starting point for social transformation. People came to understand that silence in the face of injustice only breeds more violence, and that the courage courage of one person can awaken the strength of an entire community. From the shock of the funeral, society began to change, not through empty declarations, but through concrete action. New bills were proposed, independent oversight committees were discussed, and above all, the public's faith in the possibility of self-reform was reignited. As night fell and the crowds slowly dispersed, the light from the banners still lingered on people's faces, a testament that the path of reform had been opened. From the moment a gun was pointed at a general, the entire society understood that justice was no longer a promise. It was a shared responsibility. At the Pentagon, the official ceremony was held in an atmosphere of unprecedented solemnity. Large flags hung along the corridors, the military band played a ceremonial tune, and the footsteps of officers echoed firmly across the stone floor. Reporters lined both sides, cameras capturing every detail, as everyone understood this was not just a tribute to one individual, but a powerful response from the military to the entire nation. When the clock struck the appointed hour, the highest-ranking general stepped onto the podium, his gaze sweeping across the hall, his voice resonating like a bronze bell. The honor of the military has been upheld. The short declaration carried enough weight to move every heart present. That single sentence marked the end of a tense chapter, affirming that the insult at the funeral could never erase the resilience of those in uniform. In the front row, Naomi Carter sat quietly, her uniform neatly pressed, her eyes bright yet humbly composed. When her name was announced, the entire hall rose in applause, a thunderous sound like rolling storms. She walked to the podium, each step steady and deliberate without hesitation. The general turned toward her, holding a red velvet box containing the highest honor the military could bestow. He slowly pinned it to Naomi's chest, his hands firm, though his eyes briefly glistened. As the medal gleamed under the lights, the room erupted in applause once again, longer, louder, and more heartfelt. Naomi gave a slight nod, stood at attention, and raised her hand in a crisp salute. The image was captured on camera and quickly broadcast across news networks, becoming a symbol of calm strength and quiet courage. For those present, that moment was not just recognition for Naomi, but a comfort to all the fallen, a sign that justice had finally spoken. In the hall, many veterans couldn't hold back tears, streaks running down their cheeks, but they remained standing tall, hands over hearts, in a silent vow to remember. The ceremony concluded with the general's affirmation that the military would continue to stand with the people in defense of national honor. That declaration was broadcast live, reaching every corner of the country, a firm promise that the funeral incident would not fade into obscurity, but would stand as a milestone for reflection, reform, and progress. And through it all, Naomi Carter remained standing proud, the medal shining on her chest as proof of the triumph of truth and courage. Following the Pentagon ceremony, media outlets across the country reported extensively on Naomi Carter. Major newspapers ran bold headlines calling her the steal at the funeral. They analyzed how in a moment of danger, with a gun pointed directly at her, she did not flinch, but held her head high, becoming a symbol of unwavering resolve. Many commentators argued that it was her eyes, her composure, that transformed the funeral into a historical turning point, sparking a nationwide conversation on justice and honor. Long-form articles appeared in military journals praising her as a role model for young officers and a source of inspiration for ordinary citizens who had endured injustice. Television repeatedly aired the moment Naomi received her medal, intercut with footage of her standing tall before the barrel of a gun. The juxtaposition of those two moments, one of danger, the other of honor, formed a powerful contrast, both capturing the same unshakable woman. News segments confidently declared that her name had moved beyond the military sphere and into the heart of the public. The stele at the funeral was repeated across networks, gradually becoming a title granted by the people, one filled with admiration and deep gratitude. Naomi's portrait began to appear in modern history textbooks, selected as an example of courage and resolve. Schools organized talks where teachers showed the video and discussed its meaning. Young students sat attentively, many writing down the phrase, "Honor never trembles," in their notebooks as a personal reminder. On college campuses, political science, law, and sociology students used her story as a case study. They debated how a personal event could trigger collective action and how one calm figure in the storm could become a guiding compass for a generation. International conferences also invited Naomi to speak, but even when she declined, they still played footage of her as proof that strength doesn't always come from the podium, but from action itself. Her image was pinned on classroom walls, hung in libraries, featured in lecture slides, all confirming her rise as an educational icon. For younger generations, Naomi was no longer just a general, but the woman who showed them that honor must be upheld through courage and that justice only holds power when backed by unwavering action. From media to schools, from newsrooms to lecture halls, Naomi Carter's image spread widely. The stele at the funeral was no longer just a title for one person, but a living message etched into society's memory that strength can grow from pain, and from one person's defiance, a whole community can find the belief to move forward. Inside the lecture hall of a major university, the projector light cast onto the white screen, marking the beginning of a special discussion. A clip from the funeral years ago played as part of the lesson, each frame replaying the moment Naomi Carter faced the barrel of a gun and thousands rose to defend honor. Students filled every row, sitting in silence as the images appeared, their faces tense, as if reliving the suffocating atmosphere of the National Cemetery. When the video ended, the room remained quiet for a few seconds. Then a student stood up, his voice clear in the still air. "Justice can begin with a moment." That sentence immediately sparked a lively debate. Many students nodded in agreement, saying it was Naomi's fearless moment of raising her head that paved the way for the social movement that followed. One female student emphasized that justice is not a distant concept, but something that can begin with one person's courage at the right time. Another male student countered, arguing that without the community rising together, that moment might have faded like many other forgotten injustices. The exchange of ideas and voices turned the classroom into a forum of reflection and hope. The professor sat quietly, a proud expression on his face. He knew that today's lesson wasn't just in the historical material, but in the way it instilled in his students the spirit of courage and civic responsibility. He let them continue their debate before concluding slowly, "A moment can start it, but a new generation is the force that keeps justice moving forward." The whole class applauded, not loudly, but with a solemn rhythm, affirming that they had just received a mission. Outside the classroom, the hallway echoed with ongoing conversations. Students gathered in groups, still discussing Naomi's story, as if it weren't just a past event, but a fire passed on to them. Many chose to research legal reform for their projects, while others signed up for community organizations to train in social activism. These decisions were proof that the funeral moment didn't end in a video clip, but planted seeds of change in the minds of the young generation. In every notebook, every presentation, Naomi Carter's name appeared not as a distant figure, but as a guide. Justice can begin with a moment became a slogan for many student-led events, printed on banners in lecture halls and posted on club walls. And from that spark, a new generation was rising, carrying the belief that they could carry forward, that they could protect honor and justice, refusing to let any gun barrel silence the truth ever again. After the lively discussions in lecture halls, Naomi Carter's influence didn't remain confined to theoretical conversations. At recruitment centers, the number of young people enlisting rose noticeably, with many openly sharing that they were inspired by her unwavering example. Young faces stood in line, eyes shining with determination, believing that wearing the uniform wasn't just a duty to protect the country, but also a direct way to carry forward the unyielding spirit Naomi had shown. In brief interviews with the press, many recruits stated clearly that the moment she refused to bow before a gun barrel was the reason they chose this path, because they wanted to prove that honor could not be defeated. Training centers received the new recruits with surprise, as many came from seemingly unrelated fields. Law students, young engineers, even those once pursuing the arts, stepped through the gates of military camps carrying the belief that justice needed protectors. They saw Naomi not just as a general, but as a role model for a new generation, resilient, clear-minded, and willing to face the greatest tests. This diversity showed that the funeral story didn't just touch a small group, but had spread, connecting all layers of society in a shared belief. On social media, the movement spread powerfully. Photos of new recruits holding the national flag were shared with captions like, "We walk in Naomi's footsteps." Short videos showing young people reciting "Honor does not tremble" before signing enlistment papers gained millions of views. Citizens saw this shift with emotion, realizing that sacrifice and courage could inspire an entire generation to follow the path of service to their nation. Naomi's story, therefore, didn't end in the courtroom or at the medal ceremony, but became a lifelong source of motivation. Educators regarded it as a prime lesson in how one person's strength could shift society. Parents brought up her name at family dinners, telling their children that courage doesn't belong to a gender or a status, but to a heart that refuses injustice. Across platforms, from small classrooms to international conferences, Naomi Carter was mentioned as a new symbol of conviction, a guiding torch for the younger generation. From that, the tragic funeral story transformed into an anthem of pride. It was no longer a painful memory of a day of insult, but a reminder for the future that if one person stands firm, a generation will follow. Naomi Carter entered history not just through achievements or medals, but through the power of igniting spirit, leading thousands, even millions of young people to follow her path and write the next chapter of their nation with their own courage. In the vast hall of the United Nations, white lights shone down on hundreds of rows of seats where delegates from around the world sat in order. The blue flag with the laurel wreath symbol stood out at the center of the backdrop, and interpreters listened intently through headsets to relay each speech. The normally solemn atmosphere of a human rights conference grew heavier as the chair mentioned the incident that had shaken America and spread globally, the funeral where General Naomi Carter stood tall before the barrel of a police officer's gun. The entire hall fell silent, as if in tribute, and also in readiness to receive the lesson from an event that forced an entire society to change. A speaker from Africa stepped onto the podium, his frame tall and lean, his eyes shining brightly. He spoke in a calm but firm voice. The story from that funeral is a painful reminder that power, if left unchecked, can become a tool for violating human dignity and honor. He emphasized that the tears and cries of outrage at the cemetery that day did not belong only to the American people, but also to all nations that have endured abuse of power. The hall listened closely, and nods of agreement began to appear throughout the rows. Immediately after, several other delegates took the floor, each offering their own perspective, but all centered on a shared point: the incident could not be treated as an isolated case. A European representative stressed that if a society that claims to be a leading democracy could allow a police officer to point a gun at a general during a funeral, then any country could face a similar tragedy. He called for stronger, independent oversight and greater transparency in investigations involving abuse of authority. Applause broke out, lasting longer than usual, usual, proving that his view had struck a chord with many in attendance. A female delegate from South America held the microphone, her voice deepening as she recalled protests in her own country, where many families had also lost children to police violence. She looked straight into the camera and said, "Naomi Carter is not just an American general. She is a symbol for anyone who has ever stood tall while under threat. And we must turn that story into real reform." Her words cut through the air like a blade, forcing the entire hall into silence. Murmurs rose from the back rows, but this time they were not objections, only quiet agreement. Asian countries also joined the discussion, emphasizing that police training must undergo fundamental change. Several nations proposed plans to build community oversight systems, allowing citizens to report misconduct directly instead of being forced into silence. A representative from the Middle East added that the ease with which officers are granted access to weapons must be curbed, as such leniency has paved the way for tragedy. This view received strong support, with many delegates rising to applaud, signaling agreement on the need for stricter control over weapon authorization in the hands of public authorities. After hours of debate, a draft resolution was presented. Its content focused on increasing transparency, establishing independent investigative mechanisms, improving officer training programs with an emphasis on human rights, and promoting international cooperation to share experiences in preventing police violence. Delegates signed their names, blue ink gradually filling the pages, marking a collective acknowledgement that the incident at the American cemetery had become a catalyst for global reform. The session closed with a wave of applause as the chair read the final message aloud. Human dignity must never be placed beneath the barrel of a gun. That brief statement echoed throughout the hall, evoking the gaze of Naomi Carter in that defining moment, and affirming that the lesson from the funeral was not just for the United States, but for the entire world. When the United Nations Human Rights Conference ended, the echoes of the speeches continued across headlines and discussions worldwide. The incident at the U.S. cemetery, where Naomi Carter stood tall before the barrel of a gun, was no longer viewed as a domestic matter. It had crossed borders, becoming a mirror reflecting the shared concerns of humanity. European newspapers ran front-page headlines reading, "From an American Funeral, a Lesson for the World," while Asian news channels analyzed how even a society seen as advanced is not immune to the shadow of abuse. In South America, human rights organizations used Naomi's story to draw parallels with violent incidents in the region. They printed her image on banners with the phrase "Honor does not tremble" carrying them during protests. People saw it as a way to link the pain of many nations, turning it into a shared force. A young activist declared, "If this can happen in America, it can happen anywhere. That's why every country must wake up before it's too late." That message, spread across social media in multiple languages, shared millions of times as a warning bell to the world. In Africa, where many communities have long suffered the consequences of armed violence, scholars published commentaries stating that the Naomi event was not just a political shock, but a warning about the fragility of human dignity under absolute power. Several universities integrated the story into their curricula, treating it as source material for courses on social governance and human rights. Students analyzed, compared, and asked questions. How do we prevent the same mistakes from repeating? These discussions proved that the event had moved beyond historical record, entering the educational sphere as a foundational lesson. In the Middle East, where conflict and ethnic tension still cast long shadows, many journalists argued that the funeral incident clearly showed that injustice recognizes no borders. One newspaper wrote, "The pain of a Black American soldier is also the pain of any citizen anywhere whose dignity is threatened by guns. The statement spread quickly, translated into many languages, becoming a message that crossed cultural and political boundaries. From there, the world began to reevaluate the role of law enforcement. Governments, regardless of continent, faced pressure to reform. Parliamentary sessions in several countries referenced Naomi as a vivid example, forcing them to ask themselves, is our system transparent and fair enough? Some nations announced new plans for police oversight, enhanced human rights training, and the creation of independent complaint channels for citizens. Each small step carried the imprint of the shock in America, proven that a single event can generate influence beyond borders. International historians viewed the incident as a milestone. They argued that if the civil rights movement was marked by massive marches, then Naomi Carter's case is the continuation of that struggle in a new century, turning justice and dignity into global concern. It no longer belongs only to the United States, but to all nations striving to protect human worth against the abuse of power. And so the incident became a global wake-up call. It warned that anywhere power goes unchecked, justice will be tested, and only the unity of the community can defend human dignity. The image of Naomi standing tall before a gun lives not only in America's memory, but in the imagination of millions around the world, reminding them that any society can face its defining moment, and that in that moment courage will shape the future. Years passed, and the National Cemetery remained quiet like the steady flow of time. Rows of white headstones stretched endlessly. A large flag fluttered against the blue sky, and the soft breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass mixed with memorial flowers. On the anniversary, crowds from across the country gathered holding bouquets, walking slowly along stone-paved paths toward the resting places of those who had given their lives for the nation. Among countless graves, Naomi Carter's was always covered in flowers, vivid colors standing out against gray stone. People bowed their heads quietly, laying down each stem, as if speaking to the past, as if recalling the fateful funeral that rewrote history. On the stone steps, a young man walked with his son through the crowd. The boy stopped in front of the grave, covered in white flowers, looked up curiously, and asked, "Why do they honor her?" The father paused, his eyes distant, then leaned down gently, placing a hand on his son's head, his voice calm, filled with emotion, because she taught everyone that honor cannot be broken, and justice must always be protected, even when staring down the barrel of a gun. The answer echoed in the silence, making the boy's eyes widen, as if he had just heard a legend he hadn't lived through. Around them, others quietly told the story to their children and grandchildren. An elderly man leaned on his cane, his cloudy eyes brightening with pride as he recalled the day Naomi refused to bow her head. A young woman softly placed a photo of her on the headstone, whispering words of thanks. A group of students brought small flags bowing as they whispered the old slogan, "Honor does not tremble." These fragments of memory were passed down through generations, from those who witnessed to those who only heard, but all shared the same belief that Naomi Carter had left behind an undying legacy. In schools across the country, her story continued to be taught as part of modern history. Paintings of the funeral moment hung in hallways, and textbooks dedicated entire chapters to her as a witness of the era. Law students studied the case as a model in human rights, and military cadets saw her as the embodiment of courage. Her legacy was not in glittering medals, but in the hearts of future generations, where will and honor were passed like a burning torch. Each year, the media retold her story, not as a distant event, but as a reminder that abuse of power could always return if forgotten. Documentaries showed people laying flowers, children holding small flags in solemn posture, and interviews with veterans moved to tears. That image became a familiar symbol every memorial season, prompting society to reflect and ask, have we lived worthy of the legacy Naomi left behind? In the evening sky, the last last rays of sunlight fell gently on the grave, reflecting off the pure white petals. The young man held his son's hand as they walked away. The boy, looking back, his eyes seeming to understand a little more of what the word justice meant. The crowd continued to come and go, but those footsteps never ceased as proof that Naomi Carter had never left the collective memory. She was not just a general, not just the woman who stood tall before a gun, but an enduring symbol of belief, pride, and a society that knew how to rise in defense of honor. And from this place of rest, her story continued to live, lighting the way for both today's and tomorrow's generation. The child looked up, waiting for an answer, while the father stood silent for a moment, searching for words simple enough to stay in the boy's memory forever. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice steady in the still air of the cemetery. "Because she taught us that justice never bows its head." That sentence was not just for the child, but for everyone standing around the flower-covered grave. It made a few people stop and nod, a few veterans wipe away tears, and young students holding small flags softly repeated the words like a vow. The boy looked at his father wide-eyed, as if realizing that the respect Naomi received came not from rank or medals, but from her fearless stance in a defining moment. From that day on, the father's answer spread further, quoted in speeches, printed on book covers, and featured in countless media articles. It became a simple but powerful motto, a message carried through time to remind every generation that justice cannot be bent by violence or fear. Teachers included it in their lessons, posting it on classroom walls as a guiding principle. Students used it as the epigraph for their theses, while journalists opened human rights commentaries with it. Each time the words were spoken, people saw the image of Naomi Carter, who had written that truth with her own unwavering resolve. Her image, therefore, existed not just in old footage or the metal on her uniform, but as an eternal symbol. In the city's main square, a bronze statue of Naomi, standing tall, eyes fixed ahead, became a place where people gathered during holidays and memorials. Children ran around its base, while parents knelt down to retell the story, so even those who had never witnessed the event could still feel the power of her defiance. Schools across the country displayed her portrait in their libraries, and beneath each frame was engraved the same line, "Justice never bows its head." Not only within the country, Naomi's image also appeared in international reports, human rights conferences, and global campaigns for security reform. She was mentioned as a model of courage, proof that even in the darkest moments, one person could ignite hope for an entire society. Successive generations found in her story the motivation to rise to fight and to protect what is right. From a funeral marked by tragedy, Naomi Carter crossed the boundaries of time and national borders, becoming an eternal symbol of honor and justice, living on in memory and in the hearts of humanity. The story of General Naomi Carter began on a day meant for silence and solemn tribute, but it turned into a defining moment, changed society. When Bradley Cole pointed a gun beneath the national flag, she did not bow her head, and from that fearless gaze, the nation was awakened. That event did not end at the National Cemetery, but grew into a wave of public outrage, then reached the courtroom where justice asserted its power with a life sentence for the abuser. Through each stage of the story, from the shame of oppression to the unity of a community, from marches to tennis trials, Naomi Carter became living proof that honor can be protected even in the most dangerous of circumstances. What happened was not just a legal case, but a journey of social awakening. The people rose from silence, turned anger into action, and launched a movement for reform. The military affirmed its responsibility by honoring Naomi, while the press and the education system spread her image like a guiding torch. Congress, the Pentagon, and the United Nations took the case beyond one country's borders, turning it into a global lesson on the limits of power and the strength of human dignity. All of it showed that justice does not come from handouts, but from a shared voice and the determination to protect what is right. From there, new generations found inspiration to carry on. Students debated the meaning of justice in classrooms, young people enlisted to live by the spirit Naomi left behind, and children listened to the story told by their parents to learn that honor cannot be defeated. When a father told his son at her grave, "Because she taught us that justice never bows its head," that answer was not only for the child, but a message to all of humanity. The greatest lesson from this story is the power of resolve. Naomi didn't shout, didn't need to display force, but her gaze alone was enough to shake the barrel of a gun, enough to unite an entire community. That steadiness became the strongest weapon, sparking the belief that justice can be tested but never erased. The second lesson is the power of community. From the funeral to the courtroom, from the streets to the halls of legislation, the people proved that when they speak together, they can force the entire system to change. And the third lesson, perhaps the most important, is the reach of legacy. One event, one person, one moment can plant the seeds of change for an entire generation, even for the world. Naomi Carter's story reminds us that justice doesn't live in rigid documents, but in the hearts and actions of people. When one person dares to stand tall, the whole community finds a reason to rise. When honor is protected with courage, it becomes an eternal symbol shining for generations who never witnessed that fateful funeral but still feel its power. And when a child asks their father why people honor Naomi, the answer is not just a memory, but a reminder that in any circumstance, justice must be preserved through resolve and unity. From that day at the National Cemetery to today's lecture halls, from the verdict in court to international resolutions, Naomi Carter has left a lasting legacy. She was not just a general, not just a woman standing firm before a gun, but became an unbreakable steel figure, a symbol of a simple yet profound truth. Justice can be tested, but it will never bow.